Good morning, everyone. Hope everybody is enjoying their holiday weekend. And today, I have the history of tobacco, part 2. Well, I think in the last episode, we ended with Christopher Columbus, fixing to set sail for the New World. And this is where tobacco history is really going to start to kick off. But before we get into that, got my Missouri Meerschaum Great Dane spool. In it, I have some Captain Black. Drink pairing today, coffee in this here fancy cup that I got from Pipes and Cigars as a gift over 4th of July. It makes a great coffee mug. Still a little warm. Probably should have took the lid off, make it cool a little faster. But anyway, it's not important. We're all here for the history of tobacco. See if we can get through it without knocking the camera over or getting eaten alive by flies. So, anyway, August 3rd, 1492. Columbus set sail from Spain. Now, we all know he has his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And he is on a mission to find water passage to Asia and the Indies. Anyway, him and his crew sail for 67 days west. And they eventually spot land on October 12th, 1492. Anyway, they land in what Christopher Columbus named San Salvador. And there he's greeted by the Arawak people. Now, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, but I'm not really too sure how that would be pronounced, so I'm just going to say it out spelled. And Christopher Columbus mentions in his journals that they come out and greet him, and they're really excited. They not really quite too sure what to think. They interpret, what they're trying to ask through hand signals and stuff as if they had come from heaven. And anyway, they all get out and they make their claim for Spain. And they start, trying to get information about the island, where they're at, and stuff like that from the natives. Anyway, there's gifts exchanged. The natives bring different little things made of wood, wooden spears, wooden trinkets, all sorts of different stuff. There's cotton twine rolled in the balls that are brought, various different types of fruits, and of course stacks of dried leaves. Now, they're recorded as saying, and there's several different translations of this. Christopher Columbus wrote his reports and his journals in medieval Spanish. So there's a few things lost in translation, or don't quite translate fully into modern English. But I got to looking, and there's several different translations of, just about everything in his journals. So I'll try to give the best translations here. But anyway, they describe the dried leaves as giving off a distinct fragrance. Other translations translated as giving off a pungent smell. Either way, the translation, could be made to say smelly leaves. They weren't quite too sure what to think of them. Anyway, they traded back and forth. The Spaniards gave the native folks glass beads, jewelry, bells, capes, caps, all sorts of different stuff, and this went on for several days. There was kind of this, show of goodwill, I guess you could say. They were trading back and forth with one another. But anyway, the mention of these dried leaves next is the Spaniards trying to figure out exactly what they are. It's mentioned that the men ate the fruit. They stored the cotton and the other little things down below deck to take back to Spain. But the dried leaves, they weren't really quite too sure what to do with. It says they found them to be inedible, and they really couldn't figure out what to use them for, so they ended up just tossing them overboard. Anyway, the next mention of these tobacco leaves is a few days later, October 15th, 1492, and Columbus mentions finding a man rowing a canoe, and with him he had a bunch of these bales of dried leaves, and they had been observing that the natives really seemed to revere these leaves. They observed them, trading them back and forth, using them as kind of like a currency. They were constantly bringing them to the Spaniards as gifts, and Columbus and his men, really started to figure out that these things had some value to the native peoples. And he even mentions in the journal that this man in the canoe that came aboard their ship brought the same dried leaves that were presented to him as gifts at San Salvador. But anyway, we're going to skip ahead just a little bit. It's almost a month ahead to when smoking was first discovered. Sorry, I'm telling you, these bugs are getting after me today. But anyway, the first Europeans credited with observing smoking was Rodrigo de Jerez and Luigi Torres. And Columbus had sent them out on a scouting mission, still believing that they had landed somewhere in Asia. They weren't quite too sure exactly where they were yet. They didn't know if they were someplace completely new or if they were off some unknown island off the coast of Asia. So he sent these two guys inland a little ways there to kind of scout ahead, ask questions, and try and figure out where they were from the locals. And they came back and reported to Columbus. And in his journal he writes, the two Christians met with many people on the road going home, men and women, with a half-burnt weed in their hands, being the herbs they are accustomed to smoke. There's also another translation that I got here, and it says, with a brand in their hand and herbs to smoke as they are accustomed to do. So there's a couple different translations of it there. But we do know that Rodrigo de Jerez became the first known European smoker, and some of Luigi Torres's writings that actually made it back to Spain kind of capture a little bit of that. Apparently, while they were out scouting, they came across a village, and they were invited in by the folks that lived there, and they observed them smoking these dried leaves in wrapped up palm leaves or maize leaves. And what they would do is form them to make these muskets, as they called them in their writings, and they would light one end on fire and then drink the smoke from the other end that was not lit. And let's see, the exact translation here is, they wrapped the dried leaves in palm or maize in manner of a musket formed of paper. After lighting one end, they commenced drinking the smoke through the other. So, but after observing this, Jerez decided, he wanted to give this a try. And Torres reports that he spent the next 4 days in a hut with the village elders and other tribesmen smoking. Said several times he went to fetch Jerez so they could go back, and each time he'd open the door or the flap to this hut, smoke would just come rolling out, and he'd try and convince Jerez to leave. Jerez kept trying to convince him to, he needed to try this here tobacco, or this here plant, that it was really enjoyable, and that he'd think he'd like it. But Torres, mentioned that he just couldn't really stand to be around the smoke. It didn't set too well with him, didn't agree with him any. And he'd always go back and hang out with the other tribesmen that weren't smoking. So, and he also mentions that whenever Jerez came out of the hut some 4 days later, that his teeth were a very unnatural brown color from all the smoking that he had been doing. So, but That's some of the first recorded tobacco use that we have from Europeans, anyway. And of course, there were other translations from folks that went with Columbus on his voyages. Actually, there's one translation from a guy that went on his second voyage with him. And I got that translation here as soon as we flip it over here and get to it. Oh, I told you I'm going to knock that camera over. Probably at least once today. But anyway, it translates as they take it and roll it in a manner as children do at Easter. Or roll it in paper muskets as children do in Easter, and then they light one end and imbibe the smoke through the other. And that's the only translation of that passage I could find, and I'm not really too satisfied with it, but it's pretty neat, nonetheless. I'm pretty sure there's a better translation out there buried somewhere, but I wasn't able to find it. Trying to go out here. But anyway, Columbus and his men continue exploring the Caribbean there for a little over 5 months or so before they decide they're going to return to Spain. Now, before he left, Christopher Columbus left 39 of his men behind, and they were going to build a settlement that they called La Navidad, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But anyway, that would be in present-day Haiti. And the expedition ended up arriving back in Spain March 15th, 1493. The whole trip from Spain to the New World and back to Spain ended up taking around 221 days. Now, we talked a little bit about the men who discovered smoking, and I'd like to, talk about them a little bit more. Now, Luigi Torres was one of the 39 men left behind to help build this new European settlement in the New World. And we don't really know exactly what happened, because none of the men that stayed behind to start that settlement survived. But whenever Christopher Columbus returned a little over a year later, he found the settlement completely wiped out. And they gathered from the locals that they had started out, there was some sort of internal strife going on. And they varied widely. Was it a power grab? Was it something having to do with religion? There was, talk of religious arguments breaking out between different factions of the men that were left behind, and it ended up causing a fight. But nobody really knows for sure exactly what happened. We just know there was some sort of internal fight that ended up, killing a lot of folks. And then one of the tribes, local tribes there, came in and finished the rest of them off as retaliation for Columbus taking with him 25 of the local natives there. And he took them back to Spain in order to, so we'd be able to learn the language, convert to Catholicism, and then come back and help the Spaniards with further explorations of the New World. But they attacked the settlement in retaliation for that, and ended up, wiping the rest of them out. So unfortunately, Torres didn't survive a year after first observing tobacco being used. And Rodrigo de Jerez, the first man to, or the first European to use tobacco, he enjoyed it so much that he ended up taking a whole bunch of tobacco and tobacco seeds with him back to Spain. Well, it turns out his neighbors were so frightened by seeing the smoke and or observing him smoking, that they ended up turning him into the authorities. Well, he ended up being brought before the Spanish Inquisition and sentenced to prison. And how they put it is they imprisoned him for his sinful and infernal habits, because only the devil could give a man the power to exhale smoke from his mouth. And he ended up being imprisoned for 7 years. And by the time they let him out, smoking had pretty much caught on and was common practice in Spain. Well, I wonder why it took him 7 years, to let him out of there. I mean, was one of the members of the Inquisition, just sitting around, enjoying a smoke, and then it just dawned on him like, hey, didn't we throw a guy in prison for this? Somebody better let him out, But anyway, that didn't stop him from going back to smoking once he was out. So that's dedication right there. And man, if we thought, the anti-smoking campaigns were bad nowadays, I mean, I couldn't imagine, being the first guy to bring it back to Europe. I mean, 7 years in prison seems pretty extreme. But anyway, Christopher Columbus would end up making a total of 4 voyages to the New World. And the sailors that were, with him, and, the ones that followed after, would have a great deal to do with tobacco spreading around the world. It started out in Spain, started to spread, to other parts of the world, and slowly it became the only crop from the New World that ended up being used in every single country in the world. But that'll be a topic for another day. Until then, I'm going to get off here. Enjoy the rest of this pipe, finish off this coffee. Hope everybody enjoys their Memorial Day weekend. Stay safe out there. And, yeah. Have a great holiday. But until next time, we will talk to y'all later.